Kirith Ascendancy had catalogued 412 sapient species across 11,000 years of expansion, and not one of them had taken longer than 6 hours to surrender once an Ascendancy dreadnought entered orbit and displayed the ultimatum array. 6 hours was the median. The Urthali had folded in 40 minutes. The insectoid hive clusters of Praxis Minor had capitulated before the dreadnought had even finished its deceleration burn, transmitting submission corals on every frequency simultaneously, as if terrified the Ascendancy might not notice fast enough. Surrender, to every civilization the Kirith had ever catalogued, was simply the correct output of a simple calculation. Their weapons against our weapons, their fleet against our fleet, their extinction against our mercy. The math always resolved the same way. It was, Admiral Threl Vankaish had been taught since his larval instruction cycles, the only rational response available to a species that valued its own continuation. So when the analysis packet came back on Earth, a blue-white marble smeared with cloud, its surface radio-loud with a bewildering chatter of overlapping languages, its biosphere technically inefficient, its species biologically fragile, disease-riddled, short-lived, and by every metric the Ascendancy's cognition engines could produce, catastrophically primitive, the decision to send scouts instead of a fleet was not mercy. It was thrift. Sending a 100-ship armada to a civilization that hadn't yet cracked practical fusion would have been like deploying a battleship to sink a rowboat. 17 scouts, cloaked, singular, surgically precise, would be sufficient to confirm the assessment, identify points of leverage, and file the necessary reports so that the inevitable ultimatum could be delivered with maximum efficiency and minimum resource expenditure. Threl remembered signing the deployment order. He remembered the particular satisfaction of a clean, elegant solution, 17 data points, 17 confirmations, 17 reports converging on the same conclusion that every other conquered world had converged on. He remembered thinking, with the closest thing his species allowed itself to smugness, that Earth would be catalog entry 413 by the end of the cycle. That was 141 days ago. 17 scouts had descended into Earth's atmosphere in 17 separate cloaked vessels, scattered across the planet's surface like seeds thrown into wind. Lagos, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Reykjavik, Marrakesh, Seoul, New Orleans, Mumbai, a dozen more, chosen by the cognition engines for maximum cultural and infrastructural variance. 17 of the Ascendancy's finest operatives, hardened by centuries of dispassionate service, biologically engineered across 4 generations to feel nothing that might compromise a mission, sent down to watch, catalog, and report. The first report came in at hour 6, precisely on schedule from Scout Vernashi stationed above Lagos. It was thorough. It was professional. It described traffic patterns, population density, energy consumption, weapons proliferation, government fragmentation. Everything the cognition engines had requested, delivered in the clipped, affectless cadence the Ascendancy trained into every operative before they were permitted to leave the hatchery halls. Threl had read it with the mild satisfaction of a man watching a familiar machine complete a familiar task. The second report, 6 hours later from the same scout, was different. It began the same way: atmospheric composition, infrastructure notes, a dry recitation of a street market's approximate GDP contribution. And then, in the final third of the transmission, Vernashi's voice did something Threl had never heard an Ascendancy operative's voice do. It wavered, not with fear, not with the tactical alarm that might accompany, say, detection by a hostile force. It wavered the way water wavers when something is dropped into it from a great height, a ripple spreading outward from a point of impact that had nothing to do with any threat the sensors had logged. "There is a sound," Vernashi's report said, and then stopped, as if the scout had needed to actually process what emerged from their own mouth before continuing. "There is a sound the locals produce in what appears to be ritualized gathering spaces. I do not have a classification for it. It does not correspond to any communication frequency of tactical relevance. It is another pause, longer this time, the kind of silence the Ascendancy's vocal processors were not designed to produce, because hesitation was inefficient and inefficiency was, in the Empire's oldest texts, indistinguishable from failure. It is called music. I have listened to 17 minutes and 42 seconds of it. I recommend further observation. Threll had flagged the report as anomalous and moved on. 17 scouts. One outlier, me. NT nothing. Statistical noise. He had run 412 prior campaigns through the cognition engines, and there was always a margin of variance, always some fraction of a percentage point that didn't fit the model cleanly. He had not been alarmed. He had, if he was being honest with himself now, 141 days and a lifetime of certainty later, been almost amused. He was not amused anymore. By day 9, 4 of the 17 scouts had stopped transmitting entirely. By day 14, it was 9. By day 23, it was 13, and the 4 who remained were producing reports that had grown so erratic, so saturated with unfamiliar vocabulary and unauthorized emotional register, that the cognition engines had begun flagging them not as intelligence but as potential contamination events. The machine equivalent, Threll thought darkly, of a physician staring at a biopsy and slowly realizing the tissue sample was not behaving like tissue at all. The Ascendancy's Council of Velkon, in their crystal chamber orbiting the homeworld of Ostravane, had convened an emergency session. Threll remembered the meeting with a clarity that felt, increasingly, like the clarity of something being carved into him rather than simply recalled. Councillor Dreeth Sumuvel, oldest of the 9, had asked the question that no one else had been willing to voice. Are our scouts dead? The cognition engines had returned a probability distribution. 14% chance of hostile action, 6% chance of technical malfunction, 80% chance, calculated with an eerie, unadorned confidence that had made the entire chamber go still, that the scouts were alive, uncaptured, unharmed, and the engine's translation matrix had struggled with the term, offering 3 separate near synonyms before settling on the least unsettling one, voluntarily noncompliant. Voluntarily noncompliant, an Ascendancy operative, hatched and grown and drilled for a purpose since the moment their cognitive lattice first achieved coherence, simply choosing not to do the thing they existed to do. It was, in the 11,000-year written history of the Kirith Ascendancy, an occurrence with exactly 0 precedent. Soldiers had died. Soldiers had failed. Soldiers had, on rare and heavily punished occasions, been captured and broken and turned. But no Ascendancy operative had ever simply decided, of their own unforced cognition, that the mission no longer mattered. That was when they had sent Threll. Not because he was the best diplomat, though his service record was immaculate. Not because he was the most skilled tactician, though the Velkon valued his calculations above nearly every other admiral's. They had sent him because he was, by every psychological assessment the Empire's finest minds had ever produced, one of the most emotionally regulated officers in the entire fleet. A man whose affect had been measured, tested, and certified inert across 4 separate deployments to hostile, chaotic, high-stimulus environments without so much as a flicker of deviation. If anyone could go to this strange blue world and remain unmoved by whatever had unmade 13 of the Ascendancy's finest, it was Threll Vankasho. He remembered thinking, as his single-occupant scout vessel broke atmosphere over what the humans called the Pacific Northwest, that the assignment would take perhaps 3 days. Locate the defectors, assess the vector of contamination, file the report. Recommend either a retrieval operation or, if retrieval proved impossible, a termination order, because an Ascendancy asset who had gone rogue with detailed tactical knowledge of the Empire's approach vectors, weapons systems, and command structure was not a loose end that could be permitted to remain loose. He had not expected to still be here, 138 days later, sitting in the corner booth of a dimly lit establishment in a city called New Orleans, with a glass of something the humans called bourbon in front of him that he had not yet permitted himself to drink, listening to four humans on a small raised platform produce sound with brass and wood and stretched skin, and their own bodies that was currently, at this exact moment, disassembling something in his chest that he had been told his entire life did not exist to be disassembled. The first defector he found was Vernashi. It had taken him 11 days of methodical, professional investigation, cross-referencing energy signatures, tracing the faint cloaking field harmonics that even a decommissioned ascendancy vessel left bleeding into local electromagnetic noise, following the digital footprint of a being who had once been trained to leave no footprint at all, before the trail led him to a narrow street in Lagos lined with vendors selling grilled corn and fried plantain. The air thick with 100 overlapping conversations in Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Pidgin English, and the low P. Percussive undertone of music leaking from a dozen different open doorways at once. He found Vernashi sitting on an overturned plastic crate outside a shop that repaired mobile telephones, wearing what he would later learn was called a dashiki, in a shade of blue-green that no ascendancy garment had ever been permitted to be, because ascendancy uniforms existed on a strict grayscale gradient, calibrated to communicate rank without communicating anything so unnecessary as aesthetic preference. Vernashi's four eyes unconcealed, because the biometric camouflage field had apparently been switched off entirely, an act of carelessness that would once have been unthinkable, were half-lidded, and there was a small device clutched in one lower hand that Threll would come to recognize as a phone, from which was emanating, at moderate volume, a rhythmic, syncopated, deeply layered wall of sound that a passing human youth had identified for him days later as Afrobeats. Vernashi. Threll had used the scout's designation with the flat authority he'd used on 400 prior operatives across 400 prior worlds. You are in violation of Ascendancy Protocol 12 Delta. You will restore cloaking, cease unauthorized cultural absorption, and prepare for immediate extraction. Vernashi had looked up at him slowly, unhurriedly, in a way that no properly regulated ascendancy operative would ever look at a superior officer, and Threll remembered, even now, 127 days later, the particular quality of the scout's expression. It was not defiance. Defiance the ascendancy understood. Defiance was a known failure state with known correctional protocols. This was something else. This was the expression of a being who had heard the order, understood the order, and simply found it, for the first time in their existence, to be less important than something else. Admiral, Vernashi had said, have you heard Felacuti? Threll had not known what a Felacuti was. He knew now. He knew now with an intimacy that frightened him, because he had since spent 40 minutes of an evening he would not admit to enjoying listening to a compilation of recordings that a human bartender in this very city had, unprompted, decided he needed to hear, horns stacking on horns, a voice railing against corruption and power in a language he'd needed real-time translation to parse, and he had felt something in his sternum that the Ascendancy's medical texts had no vocabulary for. Something that was not quite the tactical alertness spike of adrenaline, and not quite anything else in his four-generation engineered emotional palette. Something that made him want, absurdly, embarrassingly, to move his own body in time with the rhythm. That is not a relevant question, he had told Vernashi that first day in Lagos, with the last full measure of his old certainty. Report your operational status. My operational status, Vernashi had said, and there had been something in the scout's voice that Threll, in his most private and unrecorded thoughts, could only describe as pity, is that I have spent 41 years of my life believing that feeling was a design flaw the Ascendancy had successfully engineered out of us. And 3 weeks ago I heard a 14-year-old girl play a violin on a street corner in this city, badly, missing notes, sweating in the heat, and I stood there for 2 hours because I could not make my legs carry me away from it. I do not have a report, Admiral. I have never been more thoroughly debriefed by anything in my life than I was by that violin. Threll had filed Vernashi's noncompliance, flagged the scout for retrieval pending review, and moved on to the next name on his list, telling himself that Vernashi was an aberration, a singular weak node in an otherwise sound system, the kind of statistical outlier that existed in even the most rigorously selected population. He had told himself the same thing after the second scout, and the third, and the fifth. The third scout, a former weapons calibration specialist named Heskori, he found in Reykjavik, of all places, a city so far from the humid chaos of Lagos that Threll had briefly wondered if the cognition engine's deployment algorithm had simply erred. Heskori had not gone to ground in a nightclub or a gallery. Heskori had gone to ground in a bathhouse, submerged to the collarbone in a geothermal pool under an open sky the color of a fresh bruise, steam rising off water that smelled faintly of sulfur, watching what the locals called the aurora borealis crawl across the heavens in slow, silent ribbons of green and violet. "I have run the numbers, Admiral," Heskori had said, not moving, not even turning to acknowledge Threll's arrival with more than the barest tilt of one antenna. "Do you know what our own homeworld's night sky looks like from orbit? Flat, correct, predictable, this." A slow gesture, one clawed hand breaking the water's surface to indicate the shifting light above them. "This violates 11 separate atmospheric models I was issued before deployment, and it is the single most beautiful malfunction I have ever witnessed, and I have decided I no longer care that it should not, by any reasonable physics, move me at all." The fifth scout, Threll found busking, an unfamiliar verb he'd needed explained to him twice, on a subway platform in Seoul, playing a 6-stringed instrument the humans called a guitar with a proficiency that should have been impossible for someone who had held the instrument for less than 4 months, earning enough in loose coins and folded paper currency to fund a life he had, evidently, decided was worth funding. He wrote the 6th defection off, in his own private thinking, as confirmation rather than aberration, though he still did not permit himself the word defection in his official transmissions, using instead the clinical phrase extended field immersion with reduced check-in frequency. Because some part of him, the part that had not yet admitted what was happening to his own cognition, still believed that precise language could hold back an imprecise, spreading truth. By the 9th scout, a former surveillance specialist named Ovashti, whom he found not hiding but performing, standing on an actual stage in a converted warehouse in Berlin, human biometric camouflage rendering their 4-jointed limbs into a passable approximation of human proportions, playing something called a cello, with an intensity that had made the assembled humans weep, actually weep. Salt water running down their faces in a display of unregulated emotional leakage that the ascendancy would have classified as a medical emergency. Threll had stopped telling himself anything at all. He had simply stood at the back of that warehouse in the dark and listened to a piece of music that Ovashti later told him was called Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 in G major, and had felt, for 4 minutes and 9 seconds, something in his own chest crack open like a hatchery shell splitting to release whatever had been growing, unnoticed, inside it. He had left the building before anyone could see his face. His reports back to the Velcon grew over the subsequent months, shorter and more clipped, not because he had less to say, but because he had begun to understand with a dawning, horrified clarity that every additional word he transmitted was a data point the Council could use to justify the thing he was increasingly certain they would eventually order: the total, sterilizing destruction of a species whose only crime was making things so beautiful that an empire built on 11,000 years of disciplined emotional suppression could not survive prolonged contact with them. He wrote about the food first, because food was easiest to frame in purely biochemical terms, the kind of clinical, defensible language the Council expected. He described in his official reports the human culinary tradition as a highly variable nutrient delivery system employing chemical compounds, capsaicin, in particular, that trigger a controlled pain response the local population has, inexplicably, learned to seek out recreationally. What he did not write, what he could not bring himself to transmit through official channels, was the way his own biology, engineered across 4 generations to find sustenance a purely functional, joyless act, fuel intake calibrated for maximum efficiency and minimum sensory engagement, had reacted the first time a street vendor in Seoul had handed him a paper cup of tea diakbaki, rice cakes glistening in a red-orange sauce that had made his eyes water and his mouth burn, and, against every design specification his species had ever been built to, had made him want immediately to eat more of it. He did not write about the noodle shop in a back alley in Chengdu where an elderly woman had watched him disguised, sweating, undone, eat 3 consecutive bowls of something so violently spiced that his vision had briefly blurred and had laughed, not unkindly, and brought him a 4th bowl unasked, on the house, because he had the face of a man who needed it. He did not write about how he had gone back to that alley 6 more times in the following weeks, alone, unauthorized, telling himself each time that it was reconnaissance. There were other meals he did not write about, because by the time he tried to compose the sentences, he found he did not trust himself to stop at a paragraph. A single perfect tomato, still warm from a Roman rooftop garden, sliced thick and drizzled with an oil so green and grassy it tasted like sunlight condensed, salted with a hand so casual and so exact that he had asked the old man who'd grown it to teach him, and had spent an entire humiliating, joyful afternoon failing to replicate the ratio. A bowl of pho eaten alone at 4 in the morning in a plastic chair on a Hanoi sidewalk, steam fogging his borrowed human face, the broth carrying a depth of flavor that his species' finest chemists, with all their molecular precision, had never once thought to attempt, because why would they? Nutrient delivery required no depth, only sufficiency, and sufficiency, he now understood with something like grief, was the saddest word his empire had ever built a civilization around. He thought more than once, standing over some new bowl or plate or paper-wrapped parcel of food, that a stranger had made with their own hands for no reason, but the plain animal pleasure of feeding another living thing well, that this was perhaps the cruelest and most elegant proof of everything he was beginning to suspect, that a species did not need chemical warfare to dismantle an empire. It only needed to be very good, without any strategic intention at all, at being kind to the mouths of strangers. He wrote about the visual arts next, and this was where his professional language began, for the first time in his career, to visibly strain against the thing he was actually trying to describe. He stood for 11 minutes, he had checked, later, on the timestamp of his own internal chronometer, disbelieving of how long it had actually been, in front of a canvas in a museum in Amsterdam, a swirling, thick-painted night sky over a small sleeping village, done by a human who Threll learned from a placard, had died believing almost no one valued his work at all, and had felt something rise in his throat that he did not have a name for, and that no ascendancy physician had ever needed to treat, because no ascendancy citizen had ever needed a word for the specific ache of understanding, all at once, that a being could suffer his entire existence in obscurity and still choose, again and again, to put something this alive onto a flat and lifeless surface for no reason that served any survival function whatsoever. His species built things to serve functions. Ascendancy architecture was flawless in its efficiency and utterly without ornament, because ornament was resource expenditure without tactical return. He had never, not once in 190 years of a long and disciplined life, stood in front of anything his own civilization had built and felt the specific vertigo of being looked back at. He wrote, in the driest terms he could manage, that visual representation appears to serve an unquantified psychological utility for the species, possibly related to mortality salience management, and did not mention that he had bought, with currency obtained through means he would also not be detailing in any official report, a cheap print of that same painting from the museum gift shop, and that it was currently rolled in a protective tube in the cargo hold of his cloaked vessel, and that he had unrolled it and looked at it alone on 11 separate nights since. The music was the part of his reports he wrote the least about, because it was the part he could no longer pretend to analyze from any safe clinical distance at all. He had, by day 60, listened to what a human acquaintance, a jazz pianist in New Orleans named Odell, 61 years old, who did not know what Threll actually was and had simply assumed he was a strange, quiet foreign fellow with impeccable manners and no taste yet, had begun calling his education. Odell had started him on Louis Armstrong, on the theory that a man needed to understand joy before he could understand anything sadder, and Threll had sat in the corner of a small, humid, red-lit club and listened to a trumpet reach for notes that seemed to physically pull at something behind his sternum, and had thought, with the calm horror of a man watching his own hand catch fire and finding he did not want to put it out, "This is what has been eating my scouts alive. This is the vector. It was never a weapon. It was never a virus in any sense my cognition engines were built to detect. It is simply this, the unbearable, indefensible beauty of a species that has spent its entire short, fragile, dying existence making things that do not need to exist, purely because making them felt like being alive." Odell had then moved him on to Coltrane, and Threll had needed, after the first time he heard A Love Supreme in its entirety, to walk for 4 hours through the humid New Orleans night before he trusted himself to speak to anyone again, because something in the fourth movement, Psalm, Odell had called it, said Coltrane had transcribed an actual written prayer into the notes themselves, translated devotion directly into sound, had made Threll, for the first time since his hatching, genuinely afraid. Not of any tactical threat, afraid of himself, afraid of what he was becoming or what he was discovering he had always secretly, barredly been, underneath 4 generations of engineering meant to make sure he never had to find out. He cataloged the rest of it anyway privately, in a file he kept off every official channel because own part of him needed to know the shape of the thing that was unmaking him, even as he stopped wanting to resist it. There was a Georgian polyphonic choir he'd stumbled onto by accident in an online archive, voices braided together in dissonances his species' own harmonic theory would have flagged as structurally unstable, and yet the dissonance resolved, every time, into something that felt less like music and more like grief and gratitude agreeing, at last, to occupy the same body. There was a 3-minute pop song, absurdly simple, 4 chords repeated with almost insulting predictability, that a teenager on a crowded bus in Manila had been singing under her breath, off-key, unself-conscious, and that had lodged itself so completely in Threll's own cognition that he had caught himself, 3 days later, humming it while calibrating a sensor array. An act of involuntary joy so alien to his training that he had actually stopped and stared at his own hands, as though they belonged to someone else. There was the low, rolling thunder of a Mongolian throat singer holding 2 notes at once, a physical impossibility his own species' vocal anatomy could not replicate no matter how many times he privately tried, alone in his cloaked vessel, at 2 in the morning, until his throat ached and he laughed, an unrehearsed, unregulated sound he did not recognize as his own the first time it happened. At the sheer absurdity of an ascendancy admiral attempting throat, singing in an empty cargo hold 11,000 light-years from home. He began, without ever quite deciding to, keeping a list. Not a report. A list, the kind a person keeps for no one but themselves, of the pieces that had done something to him he could not undo. By day 100 it had 40 entries. He understood, reading back over it one long humid evening, that he was not cataloging a threat vector at all. He was cataloging the specific, irreversible autobiography of a man falling in love with a species that did not yet know he existed. He had, by day 90, stopped filing complete reports at all. The Velkon's inquiries grew sharper, more suspicious, laced with a formality that Threll, trained across a lifetime to read the precise temperature of institutional anger, recognized as the early architecture of a court-martial. He knew what was coming. He had seen it happen to lesser officers for lesser deviations. And still, on the morning the final ultimatum arrived, a directive so absolute it left no room for the careful hedging he had used to buy himself 3 extra months on this impossible, beautiful, doomed little planet. He had felt something almost like relief. The directive was simple. The Velkon, having concluded from Threll's increasingly erratic and increasingly late reports that whatever was occurring on Earth constituted an active, self-propagating threat to ascendancy cognitive integrity. A threat that had already claimed 13 operatives and was now visibly working on a 14th, had authorized what the official language called a cultural sterilization protocol. In practice, stripped of the euphemism, it meant this. A fleet of 40 warships, already 3 weeks into transit, would arrive in Earth's system in 9 days. Upon arrival, they would deliver a 24-hour ultimatum for total unconditional surrender, broadcast on every frequency the planet's primitive communications infrastructure could receive. And if, at the end of those 24 hours, the ultimatum was not accepted, which the Council fully expected, having concluded that a species this chaotic, this fragmented, this incapable of the elementary discipline that would let 17 of the Ascendancy's own operatives resist a mere aesthetic stimulus, was in no state to organize a coherent surrender at all, every population center above 200,000 inhabitants would be sterilized from orbit, not conquered, not subjugated. Erased, a species that could turn a Kirith Ascendancy operative into an incoherent, weeping devotee of a jazz saxophonist, was not a species the Council was willing to risk making first contact with directly. It was, they had determined, cleaner to simply remove the vector entirely. Threll had read the directive twice, sitting in his cloaked vessel, hidden in low orbit above a planet he had come to love with a totality that terrified him, and had understood, with the clean and merciless logic his species prized above all things, that he had 9 days to save 4 billion people or watch them die. But he did not, in the end, spend those 9 days drafting a counter-proposal to the Velkon, though he considered it briefly in the first frantic hour after the directive arrived, before discarding the idea as tactically hopeless. The Council did not reverse sterilization protocols. In 11,000 years, they never had. He did not spend them attempting to organize a human resistance, though the idea occurred to him too, an age. He discarded that as well, both because 40 Ascendancy warships would annihilate anything Earth's current military technology could field in minutes, and because he found, when he tried to imagine standing in front of a room of human generals and explaining what he was, that he did not have the words, and was not sure he had the right. He spent those 9 days doing something he would later be unable to fully explain to himself, let alone to anyone else, something that felt less like a strategy and more like an act of faith, though faith was another word his species had no real use for. He went and found the other 13 defectors, one by one, and he told them everything. He found Vernashi first, still in Lagos, now working part-time restocking shelves in the same shop outside which Threll had first found the scout sitting on a plastic crate, and living, evenings, for a small local band's rehearsal sessions in a room above a tailor's shop. Vernashi listened to the directive with a stillness that Threll recognized, because he had felt it in his own chest 9 hours earlier, the particular, vertiginous stillness of watching something you love placed on a countdown. 9 days, Vernashi said finally. 9 days, Threll confirmed. Then we have 9 days, Vernashi said, and something in the scout's face, mobile now, human expressive in a way that would have once triggered an immediate psychological evaluation back on Ostravane, hardened into a resolve that Threll had never once seen on an Ascendancy face in 190 years of service, because it was not the resolve of an operative executing a mission. It was the resolve of a person defending a home. They found Oveshti in Berlin, mid-rehearsal, and the cellist set down the bow without being asked twice. They found a scout named Delkash in Tokyo, who had, in the 90 days since defecting, become quietly obsessed with a particular type of hand-drawn animation the locals called anime, and had begun, astonishingly, drawing his own, clumsy, alien-proportioned, but recognizably, achingly earnest attempts to capture something he'd found in a medium that had never existed anywhere else the Ascendancy had ever surveyed. They found a scout named Pasi in Mumbai, who had fallen in with a family of street performers, and had, in the process, apparently developed something the humans would call a genuine, reciprocated friendship with a 9-year-old girl who thought Pasi's 4 eyes were so cool, and had no idea her friend was, biologically, an alien intelligence officer with a security clearance that would have made the human government's entire defense apparatus weep with envy. One by one, across 6 frantic days of travel in a cloaked vessel that was never meant to make this many atmospheric entries and exits in such a short span, Threll gathered them, 14 operatives in total, counting himself, out of the 17 who had descended 141 days earlier as instruments of an empire's cold, patient conquest. Now something else entirely, something the Ascendancy had no classification system for. Something that did not exist in any of the 412 prior first contact case files, because no other species in 11,000 years had ever managed to do to Ascendancy operatives what Earth had done in 141 days without lifting a single weapon. They gathered on the 7th night in the back room of a small, unremarkable restaurant in New Orleans, Odell's cousin's place. As it happened, though Odell himself would never learn exactly why 14 strange, quiet, impeccably mannered foreigners had convened there in near-total silence around 3 pushed-together tables, and Threll stood at the head of the group and asked them the only question that mattered. "The Velkan believe," he said, "that what has happened to us is a form of contamination, a cognitive parasite this species has, perhaps unknowingly, cultivated across its history, art, music, food, story, love, designed by nothing and no one, evolved by pure accident out of the raw fact of being fragile and mortal and afraid and choosing, over and over, radically, illogically, to make something beautiful out of that fear instead of retreating from it. They believe it is a disease. They are sending 40 ships to perform a surgery. I do not think it is a disease." He paused. He had rehearsed this next part more than any tactical briefing he had ever delivered in 190 years of service, and it still did not feel adequate to the size of what he was trying to say. "I think it is the truest thing I have ever encountered. I think our empire built 4 generations of engineering specifically to make sure none of us would ever be capable of feeling it, and I think that says something devastating about what we were always afraid we might become if we let ourselves feel anything at all. I am not going to file a report recommending Retter. Evil, I am not going to file a report at all. I am going to try to stop the fleet. I do not know if it is possible. I am asking, not ordering, because none of us take orders anymore. Who among you will help me try?" 14 hands went up, not because they were soldiers following a command, because, Vernashi said quietly into the silence that followed, "We finally have something worth defending." The plan, when it finally came together across 2 sleepless nights of argument, revision, and the kind of creative, non-linear problem-solving that Threll was beginning to suspect, was itself a symptom of whatever Earth had done to his cognition, was not a battle plan, because none of them believed for a moment that 14 defected scouts, and a scattering of human allies who did not yet know what they were being asked to help with could win a battle against 40 Ascendancy warships. It was, instead, something closer to what Delkash, increasingly fluent in the vocabulary of the animation he'd fallen in love with, kept calling, half seriously, the final episode. They would not fight the fleet, they would show it the truth. Every Ascendancy warship carried a cognition engine, a vast collective processing lattice networked to every crew member's own cognitive implant, designed originally to allow instantaneous, disciplined coordination across an entire fleet without the inefficiency of verbal communication. It was also, Threll knew from his own engineering briefings decades earlier, a two-way channel, one that, under specific override protocols reserved for admirals conducting authorized cultural intelligence assessments, could be used to transmit sensory data directly into the collective lattice of an entire crew simultaneously. It had been designed to transmit threat assessments, tactical holograms, environmental hazard warnings. It had never, in 11,000 years, been used to transmit a song. Threll still held Admiral's clearance. The override protocols had not yet been revoked, because the Velcon, in their absolute confidence that no rational being could ever choose Earth's chaos over the Ascendancy's order, had not imagined they would need to be revoked. It was, Vernashi observed, almost sad, in a way none of them had the old vocabulary to properly express anymore, that the Empire's downfall would come not from a failure of security, but from a failure of imagination. They had built an empire that could not conceive of anyone freely choosing to leave it. That blind spot was, Threll thought, the only weapon he needed. The next 6 days blurred into something that felt, to Threll, less like a covert operation and more like the frantic, joyful, impossible production of the single most important piece of art any of them would ever help create, because that was, in the end, exactly what it was. 14 defected Ascendancy scouts, scattered across a planet they had come to love more than the empire that made them, began compiling. Ovashti recorded the box suite that had cracked Threll open in that Berlin warehouse. Along with 4 other pieces, the cellist swore represented the sound of a species that knows it is going to die, and has decided to make that fact unbearably beautiful instead of unbearably sad. Odell, still unaware of what he was contributing to, was gently, carefully asked by Threll, under a cover story about a cultural preservation project for his employer that Threll felt genuinely terrible about, the first real guilt he had ever consciously identified in himself, for permission to record a full evening of his playing, and gave it gladly, adding, unprompted, a version of "What a Wonderful World" that very nearly undid Threll's composure a second time before he'd even finished compiling the file. Delcash contributed clips of animation, hand-drawn worlds impossibly tender and impossibly strange, alongside his own halting, earnest first drawings, because he insisted, over Threll's initial objection that amateur work might dilute the message, that the fleet needed to see not just what mastery looked like, but what it looked like for a being to try something with their whole clumsy heart for the very first time and not be ashamed of doing it badly. Posse brought recordings of her 9-year-old friend's laughter, unfiltered, unbearably alive, and insisted, correctly, Threll would later admit, that no orchestral masterpiece in the entire compiled archive would hit an Ascendancy officer's cognitive lattice harder than the simple, unweaponizable sound of a child, who did not yet know the universe contained cruelty enough to require an empire like the one they served. They gathered images, the starry night that had broken something open in Threll's chest, alongside 100 others. A sunflower field, a cave painting 40,000 years old, a photograph of 2 human hands reaching toward each other across a divide neither of them had chosen, a mural on a crumbling wall in a city that had survived a war, painted by people who had every reason to stop believing in beauty and had chosen, with a defiance the Ascendancy had spent 11,000 years engineering itself never to understand, to paint something magnificent onto the ruins anyway. They gathered food, not the food itself, which the transmission protocol couldn't carry, but the sensory memory encodings each defected scout's own altered cognitive implant had, unbidden, begun recording the moment they'd first tasted it, because it turned out the same neural pathways that had made them vulnerable to Earth's culture in the first place were also, conveniently, capable of capturing it with perfect, devastating fidelity. Threll included his own memory of that fourth bowl of noodles in the Chengdu alley, the old woman's unkind not unkind laugh, the specific unbearable warmth of being fed by a stranger who owed him nothing and gave him everything anyway. And they gathered stories, a compressed, curated cascade of human narrative, chosen with an intensity of argument that occupied their fourth sleepless night almost entirely, because every one of them had a different candidate for the story that had broken them open first, the story that had made them understand that this fragile, radio-loud, 70 species had spent its entire brief candle of a civilization writing, relentlessly, obsessively, about the exact same terrifying, glorious fact that everyone dies, that everyone loses everything eventually, and that they had chosen, generation after generation, to keep making things anyway. Poems, a folk tale about a girl who traded her voice for legs, a grainy recording of a speech about a dream, a film about a robot who falls in love with the last living plant on a dying Earth, a single, devastating haiku about a frog and an old pond that Delcash insisted, near tears, says everything, everything, in 17 syllables, and our entire cognition engine cannot say it in 17,000 lines of code. By the 8th day, they had assembled it, an archive that would have taken, if experienced sequentially at normal speed, roughly 400 hours to absorb, compressed instead into a single, dense, layered transmission designed to hit an ascendancy cognitive lattice all at once, the way Threll himself had been hit, over and over, in New Orleans clubs and Amsterdam museums and Chengdu alleyways, except concentrated into a single, overwhelming moment, instead of spread mercifully across 141 days. It was, Vernashi said quietly, looking at the compiled file the night before the fleet's arrival, either the kindest thing we have ever done for our own people or the cruelest. I don't know which. I don't think there's a difference anymore. The fleet arrived on schedule, 40 warships translating into real space at the edge of Earth's solar system, in a formation of terrible, geometric precision, and Threll, back aboard his own vessel now, cloaked, positioned at the exact coordinates the fleet's flagship would need to pass through to establish the broadcast relay for the ultimatum array, waited with a calm that surprised him, because it was not the trained calm of 190 years of ascendancy discipline. It was something quieter. It was the calm of a man who had already decided what mattered and had made his peace with whatever came after. The flagship's commander was Grand Marshal Yessik Thoivrau, a career officer whose service record Threll had studied decades earlier as a junior tactician and had, at the time, genuinely admired. Yessik hailed him on a secure channel the moment the fleet detected his vessel's transponder. Threll had not bothered to cloak the signature, because the entire plan depended on being found. Admiral Van Kaisho. Yessik's voice carried the particular flat weight of an officer who had already been briefed on exactly how far Threll had fallen, and had decided, in advance, precisely how much contempt the situation warranted. You are ordered to transmit full retrieval coordinates for all 14 compromised assets and return to escort formation immediately. Your continued noncompliance will be noted as an aggravating factor in your court-martial. Grand Marshal. Threll kept his own voice level because level was, he had learned across 141 days, not the absence of feeling but the discipline of holding feeling steady enough to be useful. Before you execute the sterilization protocol, I am invoking Admiral's Override 7, Full Fleet Cognitive Lattice Access, for the purpose of transmitting a final intelligence assessment that I believe the Council did not have available when they authorized this directive. There was a pause. Override 7 had not been formally revoked. Threll's clearance, astonishingly, still held, because no admiral in 11,000 years had ever attempted to use it for anything but a sanctioned tactical briefing, and the protocol's authors, had simply never imagined a use case that required blocking it. Yessik's voice, when it returned, carried the first note of genuine uncertainty Threll had heard from him. "This is highly irregular." "It is," Threll agreed. "I would ask you to remember, Grand Marshal, in whatever comes after this transmission, that I am not attacking your fleet. I am not attempting to harm a single member of your crew. I am giving you the same intelligence assessment that changed 14 of the Ascendancy's finest operatives, because I believe the Council's decision to sterilize this world was made without ever actually understanding what they were choosing to destroy. I am asking you, and everyone serving under you, simply to look. That is all. Just to look honestly before 4 billion people die because an empire was too afraid to risk feeling something." He did not wait for authorization to be granted or denied. He transmitted. What happened next, across the 40 ships of the Kirith Ascendancy's sterilization fleet, would become, though none of the participants could have known it in the moment, the single most consequential 11 minutes in the 11,000-year history of the Empire. And there was no elegant, clinical way for Threll to describe it afterward. In the reports he would eventually, astonishingly, be asked to write not for a court-martial, but for an entirely different kind of council. The transmission hit every crew member's cognitive lattice simultaneously. 40,000 Ascendancy officers and enlisted personnel, hatched and grown and drilled across their entire lives never to feel anything that might compromise operational readiness, suddenly and without warning flooded with 400 compressed hours of human music, human art, human food memory, human story, human laughter, human grief, human love, all of it arriving not as data but as raw, unfiltered, undeniable experience, because that was how the lattice was built to transmit sensory intelligence, not as description, but as felt reality. On the bridge of the flagship, Grand Marshal Yessik Thoivrow, a man who had not permitted himself an unregulated emotional response in over 2 centuries of distinguished service, heard the opening bars of Coltrane's psalm arrive directly into the deepest processing layer of his own cognition, saw, felt, lived, in the compressed sensory totality of the transmission, a starry night painted by a man who died believing himself worthless, tasted, through borrowed neural pathways, the specific unbearable warmth of a bowl of noodles given by a stranger who owed him nothing, heard a 9-year-old girl's laughter arrive with a clarity that made something in his engineered, disciplined chest seize like a physical wound, and by the time the transmission reached its final movement, a slow, deliberate sequence Threll had insisted on placing last, images of human hands across 11,000 years of history reaching toward each other, building, healing, creating, forgiving, again and again. In a species that had every reason across its entire violent, fragile, mortal history to give up on itself, and had, somehow impossibly, chosen instead to keep making beautiful things. Grand Marshal Yessik Thoivrow was sitting in his command chair with his face wet, in front of his entire bridge crew, in a way that no Ascendancy officer had done in front of subordinates in the Empire's entire recorded history, and he did not order anyone to look away, and no one did. Across the fleet, in 40 separate ships, the same scene repeated with 40 separate variations. Some crew members simply stopped moving, locked in place by the sheer, overwhelming density of the transmission, tears running down faces that had never before been asked to produce them for any reason but injury. Some, on at least 6 of the 40 ships, according to reports Threll would receive weeks later, began, astonishingly, spontaneously without coordination, humming fragments of the melodies they had just absorbed, unable to stop, the sound spreading compartment to compartment like the very thing the Council had originally feared, except it was not a weapon. It had never been a weapon. It was simply what happened, apparently, to any sufficiently rational mind that finally, truly understood what it had been protected from feeling its entire life. On 3 ships, weapons officers who had already begun the mechanical process of arming their orbital sterilization payloads found their hands would not complete the sequence. On the cruiser Vandessa's Edge, a young tactical officer named Presh Kelevar, barely 30, 2 years out of the officer academy, a career of spotless obedience ahead of her, found herself sitting on the floor of her station with her back against the console, unable to remember standing up, holding in her mind's eye an image that would not leave. The painted starry night, swirling, and beneath it, arriving in the same compressed instant. The specific bone-deep ache of understanding that the man who made it had died certain no one would ever love it. She had been trained since hatching to regard grief as an inefficiency to be processed and discarded. She sat on that floor for 6 minutes, grieving a stranger from another species who had been dead for over a century, and when her supervising officer finally found her, she did not apologize. She only asked, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, "Sir, were you told any of this?" "Before we came here to kill them." On the command deck of the destroyer Velashin, an entire watch rotation abandoned their posts, not in panic, not in mutiny exactly, but in the quiet, helpless magnetism of 40 separate beings, independently discovering that they could not, in that moment, care about anything the mission required of them more than they cared about pressing play again on a 3-minute recording of a human child laughing at something just out of frame. Officers who had spent decades competing for promotion found themselves, unbidden, sharing headsets, replaying the same 11 minutes for each other in hushed, reverent repetition, the way Threll himself had once stood in front of a canvas for exactly as long without meaning to. Command discipline, an institution 11,000 years in the building, did not collapse across the fleet all at once. It simply, quietly in ship after ship, stopped mattering as much as the thing it had just been shown. The fleet did not fire. Grand Marshal Yesik Thoivral did not in the end order Threll's arrest. He did not that day order the fleet to withdraw either, because withdrawal required an authority even a Grand Marshal did not unilaterally possess, and because the 11 minutes of transmission, however total their effect, did not erase 2 centuries of trained discipline in a single stroke. Old structures do not collapse from one blow, Threll would come to understand, even one this precise. What Yesik did instead, in a voice Threll heard crack for the first time in the recording, was request, not order request, a word that did not exist in the standard ascendancy command lexicon, and that Yesik seemed almost frightened to use, a full council session, remote link to Ostravane, before any further action was taken. That session took 11 days to convene, 11 days during which the fleet held position at the edge of Earth's solar system, neither attacking nor withdrawing, 40,000 crew members living in a strange, unprecedented limbo of feeling that had no established procedure to contain it. 11 days during which Threll, astonishingly, was not detained but was instead, at Yesik's own quiet, off-record request, permitted to come aboard the flagship and simply talk, for hours at a stretch, to officers who had spent their entire disciplined lives believing feeling was a design flaw and were now, for the first time, encountering someone who could tell them from the inside what it was like to choose to feel anyway and find that the universe did not end. The Council of Velkon, watching the footage of their own fleet's flagship bridge crew weeping in unison, did not immediately capitulate councils, even confronted with the impossible, rarely do, but Councillor Dreeth Sumuvel, oldest of the 9, the same councillor who had first asked whether the scouts were dead, requested, at the end of that 11-day session, a single additional piece of evidence before any final ruling on Earth's fate would be rendered. He wanted to experience the transmission himself, in full, alone, without summary, without filtration. He watched it in his private chambers on Ostravane, 400 hours compressed into 11 minutes, and emerged, according to the aide who waited outside his door, exactly 40 minutes later than expected, his eyes red in a manner the aide had never once seen in 30 years of service, holding in one trembling hand a data slate on which he had, evidently, spent much of that unaccounted time composing something. It was a single sentence, appended to the top of his official recommendation to the full council, We spent 11,000 years building an empire so afraid of feeling anything that we forgot to ask ourselves what exactly we thought we were protecting by staying numb. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. 4 of the 9 counselors held firm to the position that emotional contamination, however beautiful in its particulars, remained an existential threat to an empire whose entire architecture depended on disciplined uniformity. And Threll would later learn that Councillor Dreeth Sumuvel's closing argument to the holdouts had not been a defense of Earth at all, but a quiet, devastating question turned back on his own government. If 4 generations of engineering could not protect 14 of our finest against a single planet's art, what exactly did we think we were protecting, and from whom, and was it ever really them we feared? The 4 who dissented did not change their votes, but they did not, in the end, block the ruling either, because even they, watching the footage of their own flagship crew weeping in formation, could no longer locate the confidence to insist that what had happened to those officers was a malfunction rather than simply, for the first time in the Empire's long and disciplined history, a correction. The sterilization protocol was rescinded 3 days later. Full contact, formal, declared, unconcealed, was authorized in its place. Not conquest, not invasion, but the beginning of something the Ascendancy's 11,000-year history had genuinely never once attempted with any species it had ever catalogued. An exchange. Threll stood, 159 days after his first landing, in a small gallery in New Orleans that Odell had insisted, over 3 consecutive bowls of gumbo that Threll was by now fully addicted to and no longer even pretending otherwise about, that he simply had to see before he went back up there. Wherever it is you actually go, son, don't think I haven't noticed you're strange. The gallery held a rotating exhibit of local painters, unglamorous, unfamous, the kind of art that existed for no reason except that someone, somewhere, had needed to make it. There was a painting near the back, a woman rendered in broad, warm, unsentimental strokes, sitting on a porch step at what was unmistakably dusk, the exact particular gold-orange light of a New Orleans evening in late summer. Her face turned 3/4 away from the viewer toward something outside the frame that the painter had chosen, deliberately, never to show. Threll had stood in front of it for 11 minutes before he'd even realized he'd stopped moving. The same 11 minutes, he noted with a species of wonder his old self would have flagged as statistically improbable, and his new self simply accepted as the universe closing a loop it had opened 159 days earlier in a museum in Amsterdam. He understood, standing there, that this was the moment his own report, the one he still, technically, owed the newly reconstituted Contact Commission back on Ostravane, would need to describe. Not the fleet, not the 11 minutes that broke it, not even the 8 days of frantic, joyful, impossible compilation that 14 defected scouts had built in a back room in New Orleans. This, a grown man, 191 years old now, an admiral, a defector, whatever word finally fit, standing in front of a painting of a stranger he would never meet, on a planet he had been sent to catalog as primitive, and had instead found to be the single most alive thing his ancient, disciplined, emotionally starved species had ever encountered, feeling the same unbearable, indefensible pull he had felt in Amsterdam, the same quiet voice, older now, wiser. No longer trying to argue him out of it, simply asking, what would it cost you really to let yourself want this? Not analyze it, not report it, want it. He did not have an answer that fit into any ascendancy classification system. He was fairly sure, standing there in the gold-orange light spilling through the gallery's front windows, that he never would again, and that this specific, permanent, joyful loss of certainty, was not the failure his entire civilization had spent 11,000 years teaching him to fear. It was the beginning of something he did not yet have a word for, in any language, human or otherwise. He bought the painting. He did not file a report that day at all. Odell found him there, still standing in front of it long after the gallery's other visitors had drifted out into the evening, and did not ask what was wrong, because by now the old pianist had apparently decided that whatever was wrong with his strange, quiet foreign friend was not the kind of wrong that needed fixing, only the kind that needed company. "You look like a man who just lost an argument with himself," Odell said, settling onto the bench beside him with the particular unhurried ease of someone who had spent 61 years learning that some silences were meant to be shared rather than filled. "I did," Threll admitted. "I have been losing it for 159 days. "Which side won?" Threll considered the question with the same rigor he had once reserved for fleet logistics and threat assessments, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he already knew the answer, had known it for weeks, had simply been too disciplined to say it aloud. "The side that thinks it is worth being afraid if the thing you are afraid of is also the most alive you have ever felt." Odell laughed, low and warm, and did not ask him to explain further, and the two of them sat together in front of a stranger's painting of another stranger until the gallery lights dimmed for closing, and neither of them moved to leave until they absolutely had tea. Though he walked home that night through streets still warm with the day's heat, past a corner where a brass band was packing up its instruments after a late set, past a mural still wet in places where someone had touched up a fading section that afternoon, past a window where a family was eating dinner together with the particular unguarded noise of people who had never once had to consider that joy might need to be rationed, and he thought, with a clarity that felt less like a conclusion and more like a homecoming, that whatever report he eventually filed would never be able to capture the actual shape of what had happened to him here. Some things, he was beginning to understand, were not meant to survive translation into any language built for efficiency. They were only meant to be lived. Somewhere above the planet, a fleet of 40 ships that had once carried an ultimatum now carried, in its cargo holds, the first shipment of a very different kind of exchange. Recordings, texts, images, seeds of an old and disciplined empire's own suppressed art, offered tentatively, almost shyly, to a species that had spent its entire radio-loud, chaotic, magnificent existence making beautiful things out of the simple, unbearable fact of being alive and afraid and mortal and choosing. Every single day, to create something anyway. The Ascendancy had sent 17 scouts to assess a primitive world for conquest. Earth had sent back a painting, a song, a bowl of noodles, a 9-year-old's laughter, and an empire's own admiral, quietly, permanently, gloriously undone. It had taken, in the end, exactly 24 minutes for the ultimatum array to fall silent over Earth. Not the 24 hours the Council had allotted for humanity's surrender, but the 24 minutes it took an admiral's transmission to cross a bridge notion that 11,000 years of empire had never once thought to build. And on the other side of it, waiting the entire time, radio-loud and chaotic and mortal, and utterly unconquerable in the only way that had ever actually mattered. Humanity had simply kept on making music.